Last time we spoke about the end of the infamous First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. The Qing tried to procrastinate as much as they could in the face of a Goliath force wreaking havoc upon them. Their cannons were simply outmatched, and as a result, the British Armada was easily brushing aside their war junks and fortifications. Many horrible battles were fought, and countless Qing commanders took their own lives in shame after defeat. The closer the British forces got to Beijing, the more desperate the Qing became, and eventually Emperor Daoguang was forced to send diplomats to negotiate for a peace. The result was the infamous Treaty of Nanjing, an utter humiliation for the Qing Dynasty, marking the beginning of a century of humiliation for China. Britain grabbed Hong Kong. The Qing would pay 6 million taels of silver in reparation. But the treaty made zero mention of why the war had occurred at all. Mr. Opium. Was Mr. Opium gone? No, by no means was he. This episode is the trade of poison and pigs. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Perhaps you like visuals. I have an episode on the First Opium War, the Second Opium War, and a historic film review of 1997's The Opium War. A lot of Opium War stuff. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. So the last time we left off, on October the 12th of 1842, the last of the $6 million of payment reached the British Armada, and they finally departed from Nanjing. The tension between the Chinese and the British was, well, still raging, however. In fact, there would be another skirmish, so to say. In November of 1842, opium merchants decided to bring their wives for a trip from Whampoa to Canton, violating a Chinese taboo against mixing the sexes. The Chinese residents of Canton seized and burned the Union Jack flying over the British factory there. Defenders of the American factory shot 5 rioters before the Qing police managed to calm things down. Then the shipwrecked survivors of the Anne and Nerbudda were grabbed from jail and beheaded by some very angry Chinese. This pressed Pottinger to threaten retaliation, and soon the Viceroy of Canton, Yi Liang, rushed to the scene to arrest the ringleaders of the executions and sent them all to Beijing for punishment. The British press, such as the Illustrated London News, hailed the Treaty of Nanjing as, quote, "It secures us a few round millions of dollars and no end of very refreshing tea. It gives us an impetus to trade, cedes us one island in perpetuity, and in short puts the sort of climax to a war which satisfies our interests more than our vanity, and rather gives our glory a preponderance to gain." Now, just like the Treaty of Nanjing itself, the press made zero mention of the reason for the war in the first place, Mr. Opium. Now, with Hong Kong Island in the hands of the British, it would be used as an offloading point for opium. Well, go figure. Despite the horror of the war, the demand for opium was still raging, and thus the poisonous relationship between the two empires remained quite alive. Now, not everyone in Britain was jubilant about the situation. The Times of London condemned the opium trade and criticized the Treaty of Nanjing quite a bit. They went a step further by calling the victors of the war early Victorian Vikings, a kind of satirical nickname that would soon denote the raping and pillaging that would occur in the Second Opium War. Alongside this, the Anglican Church members of the Tory party rallied against opium. On January the 4th of 1843, Lord Aberdeen, the new boss of Pottinger's Foreign Office, told the British envoy to China, "The British opium smugglers must receive no protection or support in the prosecution of this illegal speculation." Alongside this, an order from the council gave Pottinger the power to, quote, forbid the opium traffic in Hong Kong. For Pottinger's part, he paid lip service to this by issuing a lukewarm threat on August the 1st of 1843. Opium being an article, the traffic in which is well known to be declared illegal and contraband by the laws and imperial edicts of China. Any person who may take such a step will do so at his own risk, and will, if a British subject, meet with no support or protection from HM consuls or other officers. Officially, at the least, and to what degree it mattered, there would be no more gunboat diplomacy, nor gunboat protection for opium smugglers. Now, as you can imagine, there were many of those who simply saw the dollar bill signs before their very eyes, such as Jardin and Matheson, who could not help themselves. And they were not alone. The British Exchequer also wanted to see tax revenues from the opium trade to balance the budget. At the time of the First Opium War, the opium trade accounted for 10% of the Exchequer's budget. James Matheson sent a letter to a colleague indicating he was untroubled by the status of Parliament and Pottinger's tiny little threats, because he knew it would come to nothing. The plenipotentiary, Pottinger, had published a most fiery edict against smuggling, but I believe it is like the Chinese edicts, meaning nothing, and only intended for the saints, those high church Anglicans in England. Sir Henry never means to act upon it, and no doubt privately considers it a good joke. At any rate, he allows the drug to be landed and stored at Hong Kong. And so the opium smugglers simply ignored their homeland's attempts to stop them. The opium trade did not just continue, it would thrive. The end of the First Opium War was not the end of the opium problem at all. In fact, British Parliament was coming to the conclusion the only resolution to the issue was the legalization of opium in China. As countless had done before, many in Parliament were shifting culpability to the users and their leaders rather than the dealers. Many blamed Emperor Daoguang, stating he did nothing to halt the distribution and use, which is simply a lie and a dumb one. The opium smugglers and English textile manufacturers were purchasing the mouths of members of Parliament to promote their interests. Imagine that. Lobbyists controlling political members. Boy oh boy have we evolved since then, right? Now back to the early Victorian Vikings. The heroes of the war, such as Sir Henry Pottinger, well, he was rewarded with the grand post of Governor of Madras, with an annual pension of £1,500. Charles Eliot was sent to the backwaters of Bermuda, Trinidad, and in a rather symbolic fashion, ended up in Napoleon's place of exile, St. Helena. Jardin and Matheson both left China and entered Parliament as Whig supporters. Jardin died in 1843 to an undiagnosed and rather painful illness, leaving Matheson to represent the seat of Ross and Cromarty in Parliament from 1847 all the way up to 1868. Jardin's death produced a bit of a myth that he was cursed from the opium trade, but Matheson lived to the ripe old age of 91, so take that curse with a grain of salt. Jardin Matheson's Qing counterpart, Hao Qua, died from diarrhea, so I guess 2/3 could have been said to have some kind of curse placed upon them. As for the heroic figure of Lin Zixu, his effigy became a cynosure at a museum with a plaque under a statue stating he destroyed $2.5 million worth of British property without mentioning that that said property was opium. The emperor forgave Lin Zixu in 1845 and allowed him to return to service. But as for Yi Libu, the emperor shunned his ass into exile. The Treaty of Nanjing can better be seen as a sort of truce, or perhaps in the same regard as the Treaty of Versailles. The interval period between the two opium wars was that of an armed truce, rather than a peace. After the First Opium War, opium began to get into the port of Shanghai. then onto the Yangtze River, which provided a highway for it to infiltrate the Chinese hinterlands. The Chinese population were becoming more and more addicted to the substance, as the British traders became more and more addicted to the profits. The grand vision of English textiles penetrating Chinese markets turned out to be a complete waste. The Chinese simply preferred their own homespun cloth and failed to buy the British products, while the British could not stop their increasing demand for Chinese silk and, of course, tea. Now, while the British addiction to tea did not result in weeks of den dwelling and intoxication, they still were very much addicted, and this contributed to another trade imbalance. Yes, the silver was flowing again out of Britain and back over to China. By 1857, the British would be paying China $15 million for silk and tea. Despite the enormous demand for opium, the Chinese were spending around $7 million on it, $1.5 million on cotton textiles from India, and another $2 million from Britain, still leaving Britain to owe $4.5 million back. And the Chinese policy of only accepting silver had never changed. After the First Opium War, the illicit trade became known as the poison trade. But around the same time, another terrible commerce began, nicknamed the pig trade. The pigs, in this case, were referring to coolies, who were either hired or literally kidnapped and forced into indentured servitude overseas. For those outside of North America, you might have never heard the term coolie before. It usually refers to someone from Asia who does menial labor, like working on the railroads. They are often notably treated terribly, paid almost nothing, and put into very dangerous circumstances, like having to blow up mountainsides for railroads. And you literally hear stories, especially in places like the United States and Canada, about some poor Chinese workers going into a tunnel with dynamite and never coming out after its explosion. I myself am Canadian, and this certainly is a dark aspect to our country's history, and one often forgotten. I implore anyone who might be interested to do some research on how the railroads were built, like the Pacific Railroad, and what happened to Chinese communities in British Columbia at the turn of the century. It was very horrible. Anyways, back to the story. Britain had outlawed such practices back in 1807, but this did not stop the trade, and it differed little from African slavery. Interesting thing to note here, the term Shanghaied was born from this very situation. When coolies were drugged up and thrown onto ships, often from Shanghai, this is how the term was born. So yeah, when you say, oh, I was Shanghaied, it actually referred to a time back when some poor Chinese people were drugged up and tossed aboard some ships and put into indentured servitude against their will. Now for the Chinese part, often the Qing officials would open up their jails and hand over prisoners. As indicated in a letter complaint to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Malmesbury, from a British official in Canton, it stated this: "Inequities scarcely exceeding those practiced on the African coast and on African Middle Passage have not been wanting. The jails of China have been emptied to supply labor to British colonies. Hundreds of coolies gathered together in barracoons, stripped naked and stamped or painted with the letter C for California, P for Peru, or S for the Sandwich Islands on their breasts according to their destination." Now, the British really wanted to keep the poison trade rolling on, but the pig trade was really infuriating the Qing Dynasty. This led many of the opium merchants to push for action to be made to stop the pig trade. Powerful lobbies pushed the British Parliament to enact the Chinese Passenger Act of 1855. While this act did not outlaw the trade of coolies, what it did do was codify and improve the conditions in which coolies could be transported to their place of labor. And I'm just going to say it here. You know something is really vile and evil when a bunch of opium smugglers petition to stop it. In 1850, the Daoguan Emperor died, and within his will, he begged for forgiveness for agreeing to sign the shameful Treaty of Nanjing. His fourth son became his successor, Xianfeng, who was 19 at the time he took the Dragon Throne. Unlike his more industrious father, Xianfeng did not care much for government. Xianfeng was married to a Manchu princess, but he chose to spend the majority of his time with his concubines. One of those concubines was named Cixi, and she would become one of the most important figures in modern Chinese history. Cixi participated in the selection for wives for Xianfeng alongside 60 other candidates. She was one of the few candidates chosen to stay, and Xianfeng became obsessed with her, to the point he spent most of his time in bed with her while taking puffs from his opium pipe. Oh yes, the emperor of China at this time took up the illicit drug. Cixi ended up bearing his only son, and this earned her the rank of co-empress, with the title of Empress of the Western Palace. Xianfeng's actual wife held the title of Empress of the Eastern Palace. As the mother heir, Cixi held enormous influence on the Qing imperial court. Now, going way far into the future, Emperor Xianfeng would die in 1861 after a very short life of overindulgence, and he would leave his 6-year-old son, Sichuan, as his successor. A day before his death, on his deathbed, he made an imperial edict that 8 men would act as a regency council to aid his son, later to be enthroned as the Tongji Emperor. He gave the 8 men power of regency, but indicated their edicts must be endorsed by the noble consort, Yi, and the empress consort, Zhen. These being Empress Dowager Cixi and Empress Dowager Si'an. However, Cixi performed a palace coup against the Regency Council and installed herself and Xianfeng's first wife as co-regents, who would rule China until her son came of age. After the death of the co-empress, Cixi ruled China alone until 1908. Yeah, you heard that right. 1908. This woman was a monolith of modern Chinese history, and not looked upon too favorably, mind you. Cixi was an opium addict, which is shocking given the incredible amount of power moves that she made and the amount of dominance that she held over the Qing Dynasty. Many historians believe she stuck to an opium maintenance dose that prevented both impairment and withdrawal. Anyways, she is going to be a large part of the story from this point going forward, but I can't delve too much into her life just now. I just wanted to give you just a bit of a taste for now. But I'll tell you right now, when we get closer to the Boxer Rebellion, that's going to be interesting, and there's a lot of stuff about her there. For those who don't know, if you actually go over to my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, sorry for the shameless plug, well, what's become kind of a joke, I wanted to start off my entire series on the Pacific War by explaining the major events that created it, and this led me down quite a rabbit hole. I inevitably ended up telling the history of the century of humiliation for China. So we start with the First and Second Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the First Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Russo-Japanese War, and yes, that doesn't necessarily involve China, but I mean, it's done on their territory, so it actually has a lot of ramifications for them. The Xinhai Revolution, World War I, the May 4th movement, and so on and so on. I'm actually at this point just beginning to write my 7-part series, it seems, on the Warlord era. The only reason I'm bringing all of this up is if you want to see more of the rough material, you can actually go over to my channel to see my videos, and I have pretty good visuals. I use a lot of cinematic stuff. I think it's pretty cool, and it would help me out. Anyways, back to the story. Meanwhile in China, countless disasters were occurring, both man-made and from Mother Nature. The high government office of the Qing Dynasty, which was filled by those who had passed the rigorous imperial examinations, the system that had guaranteed the competence of the ruling class, had been changed. Now anyone with 800 pounds could get around the examinations, and this led to a flood of mediocrities, albeit very rich ones who came to power. These people proved to be unequal to the responsibilities they had simply purchased, and the once industrious and highly educated Qing bureaucracy decayed rapidly. Adding to this was a horrible natural disaster, In 1856, the Huanghe River overflowed and destroyed thousands of acres of rice paddies. The capital began to starve, and with such a drastic problem came drastic solutions. As had happened to China countless times before, the decay of the imperial court combined with famine amongst the people would lead to one of the worst rebellions in human history. And it's at this point I have to explain something to the audience going forward. There are two extremely important and large events that are going to happen simultaneously in China. But I don't want to talk about them both at the same time. It would make this an incoherent jarble of stuff. The two events in question are the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864 and the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860. I will be covering both separately and in extreme depth, beginning with the Second Opium War and then afterwards the Taiping Rebellion. However, it's simply impossible to talk about one without a bit about the other, so I will begin to sprinkle some information here. Now, the Taiping Rebellion is a colossal event in modern Chinese history. It began in the southeastern province of Guangxi, and at its zenith, the Taiping rebels controlled 17 provinces in south and central China. It was the most destructive civil war in human history, causing massive hardship via military action, religio-political repression, and retaliations, and wide-scale famine as a result of Mother Nature. All told, the estimations for deaths because of this civil war are simply unreal. It is somewhere between 20 to a possible 30 million people that died. Yeah, you heard those numbers right. And I would imagine many of you in the Western world, like myself, had never even heard of this event before. It was basically the bloodiest conflict before World War I, and its death toll is quite comparable with World War I. My God, imagine, this is a civil war. All of these people are from the same nation dying. Now, like I said, there's going to be an entire series on the Taiping Rebellion, so I'm not going to go into any fine detail here, because I'm just teasing you, I don't want to give you the whole story. But allow me to go into the crazy beginning of it. The leader of the movement was a man named Hong Xiuquan, the fourth son of a hard-working rural family in Guangdong province. His family was Hakka. They are a minority group in southern China with a unique culture that differed from the Han Chinese. Hong's family did everything that they could to get enough money together so their son could get a good education and attempt to pass the first imperial examination in order to become part of the scholar gentry class. Hong failed his first two attempts and was left humiliated, so he left home and he went to Canton, where he hoped to continue his studies in order to pass a third time around. In Canton, Hong came across Protestant missionaries, and he studied a bit of the Bible under them. When Hong attempted the imperial examination for a third time, he failed yet again, and because of this, he had a nervous breakdown. Hong began to suffer delirium and a series of dreams, or what he called visions, that would change his life and that for all of China. He found himself talking with an older bearded man with golden hair and a younger man who he referred to as elder brother. The younger man gave him a magical sword and taught him how to slay demons. Now, as I may have mentioned in a previous episode, my first degree is in neurobehavioral sciences, but I don't think you need a degree in any field of psychology to know Hong probably was schizophrenic. At first, he did not associate these weird visions with anything else, nor did he act out. Instead, he worked for 6 years as a village schoolteacher, still studying to give the imperial examination a fourth go. In 1843, Hong failed the imperial examination a fourth time, and this simply broke him. His ambition to become a member of the scholarly gentry class was shattered, and he suffered a full-blown nervous breakdown again. He apparently was catatonic for over a month, and he would only come out of this stupor sporadically while screaming things like, "Kill the demons." These demons he spoke of, he later identified as traditional Chinese gods, and the emperor of the Qing Dynasty. As he gradually recovered from his breakdown, Hong began to reread Christian texts until he came to the sudden realization that the men in his visions were God and Jesus. With some quasi-logical thinking, he began to explain to himself that he failed the imperial examination because he had a greater purpose, and because he referred to Jesus as elder brother in his dreams. This meant he was the brother of Jesus. Yes, folks, Hong Xiuquan was the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ. Hong returned to Canton in 1847 to study the Bible more thoroughly under an American Southern Baptist missionary named Isaac Roberts. Shortly after, he relocated to eastern Guangxi in a rugged area known as the Thistle Mountain Range, where he began preaching and developing a new doctrine. Many converts flocked to Hong, notably many Hakka and other minority groups. Hell, even some triads joined in. The triads, of course, had ulterior motives, such as wanting to overthrow the Manchu and reclaim the Ming Dynasty. Hong, after all, was saying that he wanted to destroy all the demons and restore China on a path of righteousness. And those said demons were the Qing leaders. Now, again, I don't want to get too much into the finer details, but in 1851, Hong began a rebellion, using thousands of his converts known as the God Worshippers. Part of Hong's doctrine was that of opium abstinence, and this attracted countless opium addicts to his flock, and he helped cure them of their addiction. In many ways, the Taiping movement was something like a 12-step program for recovering addicts, but it also encompassed so much more. It included communalism, socialism, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, Robin Hood mentality, and it was quite Marxist. Hong had his forces take all the plunder and funds and pool them in a common treasury shared equally by members of the collective. Hong advocated to abolish private ownership of land and impose the death penalty on those trying to hold on to their wealth. He also made a long list of taboos, including alcohol, gambling, tobacco, prostitution, concubinage, the pig trade, and other forms of slavery. And before any of you start screaming at your headphones, by far and large, many, including Hong himself, did not follow these rules. Like I said, it was very Marxist. Hong called his movement the Taiping Qiangua, meaning Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, and he named himself the Heavenly King. The Taiping talk of expropriating land scared the hell out of Beijing, and even Queen Victoria, who received news of this rebellion. The obvious actions took place. The emperor sent forces to quell the insurrection in Guangxi province. The emperor sent Zhen Zuchen at the ripe age of 67 to exterminate the rebels. Zhen was a devout Buddhist, and he respected the god worshippers, and he decided to target the triads amongst them. By 1850, China had suffered 4 years of famine, right at the time the emperor began to escalate his attacks on the Taiping. Because of Zhen's decision to only target the triads, the emperor chose to bring out of retirement and disgrace none other than Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was given the task of eliminating the Taiping, but at the ripe age of also 67, he died while en route to Guangxi. Unfortunately, Lin Zexu never got his last hurrah chance to redeem himself. So by 1851, the Qing forces performed horribly, and they were repulsed from Thistle Mountain by the Taiping rebels, who were armed with just pikes and halberds for the most part. Cool little side note, women fought alongside the men for the Taiping, and there was a real attempt at equality amongst the sexes. Keyword, attempt. Hong eventually adapted the 10 Commandments for Chinese sensibilities to his doctrine. He named the emperor a false god in his first commandment, and added complete obedience to himself and his officers as the fourth. The commandments led Hong's rebel group to become a bona fide theocracy. By the fall of 1851, the Taiping ranks had grown to a whopping 1 million strong, mostly built up from starving peasants fleeing famine-torn areas of Guangxi province. The Qing sent forces against them in Thistle Mountain, only to lose each time. Ironically, a major reason the Taiping kept winning so many battles was because of their opium ban. Some sources estimate the Qing military engaged the rebels in this region may have been suffering a 90% opium addiction rate, which is insane if that's true. Regardless, by September the 25th of 1851, Hong felt confident enough to move out, and he led his army to conquer vast amount of territory. By January the 12th of 1853, Hong's forces took the city of Wuchang after blowing up its gates and massacring all the Manchu people they could find, deeming them demons. At this point, Hong set his eyes on a very grand prize, the old capital of China, Nanjing. Nanjing was defended by only 7,000 Manchu alongside 6,000 Qing regulars. Hong tossed 80,000 men and women soldiers into a siege of Nanjing on February the 28th, and after 2 weeks they blew a hole in Nanjing's walls. Now, I don't want to spoil any more, and honestly, everything I just brutally summarized will be covered much more in depth. But what you need to know is Hong established his own capital, the Heavenly Kingdom, in Nanjing. He built up his forces even more, performed wide-scale reforms, and created a very large administration. The Taiping became a very real threat to Beijing, and honestly, they could have overthrown the Qing Dynasty at multiple points. The Qing, for their part, in the later 1850s, were not only dealing with the bloodiest civil war the world had probably ever seen, but they were fighting the Western forces because there was a Second Opium War raging. And that is what I am building towards, folks. Trying to lay this rather insane 3D chess table of stuff going on simultaneously. Now, I've said this before, but much like the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Nanjing caused more problems than it actually solved, and it simply led to another war. China was humiliated by the conditions of the treaty. It surrendered her symbolic and practical forms of sovereignty to Britain. That bitterness was simmering since 1842, and like a powder keg, would eventually explode in 1856. In February of 1856, a French priest named Abbé Auguste Chapdelaine, my god, the old French names were just dreadful. Well, Abbé was converting a village called Xiling in the province of Guangxi, ironically in the center of Taiping rebel control. So Mr. Abbé was arrested and imprisoned. They tossed him in a cage and they set it up in the village square. Chapdelaine was in violation of Chinese law because he was performing missionary work in China's interior. Another thing that did not help his cause was the fact he shared the same beliefs as the Taiping. Well, I mean not exactly, mind you. He was a Catholic after all, and the Taiping were much more Protestant. But as the Qing would say, tomato tomato. In fact, Mr. Abbé and the other Catholic missionaries were appalled by the bastardized proto-Protestant movement that was the Taiping movement, and they actually fully supported the Qing rule. Abbé was at the wrong place at the wrong time, so to say. On February the 29th of 1856, Abbé was beheaded, dismembered, and eviscerated by his executioners, whom the rather hysterical French press claimed later took pieces of Abbé, cooked it, and ate it. Specifically his heart. Historians agree that the cannibalism story was most likely an urban legend. The French representative at Canton, Comte de Courcy, was powerless and furious. He began sending letters to Canton's viceroy, Ye Mingtian, but took no military action to avenge the death of the priest. It seems Ye Mingtian believed the French had no stomach for a fight, so he sent Comte de Courcy an insulting reply to his letters explaining that the atrocity was a simple case of mistaken identity. Chapdelaine dressed and spoke like a Chinese. Nobody thought him to be French. Well, the French would not be alone in their grievances with the Qing. On October the 8th, the 127-ton lorcha, the Arrow, a hybrid ship, as it had a British hull but Chinese junk sails, was registered in Hong Kong as a British vessel. Well, the Arrow docked in Canton with a cargo of rice from Macau en route back for Hong Kong. The Arrow's figurehead, a 21-year-old captain from Belfast named Thomas Kennedy, well, his role on board was literally just to make the ship seem like it was British-owned and operated as a British vessel, because they held privileges as a result of the Treaty of Nanjing. Well, on that said day, Kennedy was not aboard the Arrow. He had gone to another lorcha captained by another figurehead captain named John Leach. Also aboard was Charles Earle, the captain of the Chusan. At 8 a.m., the friends were having breakfast when they noticed two large Qing warships flying the Emperor's flag, carrying 60 Qing Marines. The ship was heading towards the Arrow. Qing officials boarded the Arrow and arrested her Chinese crew, bound them all, and tossed them onto the Qing warship. Leach Earl and Kennedy jumped into a sampan and rowed towards the warship to see what the hell was going on. To make the situation a bit more fun, a Portuguese lordship nearby stated later in its testimony that the Arrow had not had its Union Jack flying. Regardless, when Kennedy got to his warship, he began protesting their seizure, but the Qing forces simply sent curses his way. Kennedy tried to smooth things over, asking if just 2 of his crew could be allowed to stay on the Arrow as caretakers, and the Qing officials, they agreed and they handed 2 men over, but they took the other 12 away. Now the Arrow might seem like an unlikely prize for the Qing to seize, since it was carrying just rice, but the Arrow had a dark past, so to say. The Arrow had been built by the Chinese as a cargo ship, but it had been captured by pirates, then recaptured by Canton's viceroy, Ye Mingchen, who sold it at an auction to a comprador employed by a British firm. The comprador registered the Arrow as a British ship, but something the new owner did not look into was changing the existing crew of the ship, which included 3 pirates. The Qing would use the pretense of these pirates as a justification for seizing 12 of the crew. Later, it would turn out the registration had also expired, so by technicality, it was not a British ship at the time. Don't you hate when you get pulled over and you don't have your registration on you? Kennedy went crying about the seizure to the acting British consul, Harry Parkes, who was the consular official of 4 out of 5 ports opened by the Treaty of Nanjing. The problem of the Arrow's status did not deter Parkes, who immediately went on the offensive. Parkes ranted about, quote, "the gross insult and violation of national rights the Chinese had committed." Parkes began arguing about the treaty, requiring the Chinese to first ask permission before arresting a Chinese citizen serving on a British registered ship. Then Parkes demanded that all 12 of the crew be handed over immediately. The Qing commander explained that one of the sailors was the father of a notorious pirate, and suspected others of the crew to be pirates. Hence, he would hold them. When Parkes persisted in his demands, one of the Qing officials slapped him. Uh-oh. The humiliated Parkes returned to the British consulate and wrote a letter to Ye Mingchen, who, on top of being the viceroy of Canton, was also the viceroy of Guangxi, Guangdong, and the imperial commissioner in charge of foreign affairs. "I hasten therefore to lay the case before your excellency Yi, confident that your superior judgment will lead you at once to admit that an insult so publicly committed must be equally publicly atoned. I therefore request your excellency that the men who have been carried away from the Arrow be returned by the captain to the vessel in my presence, and if accused of any crime, they may be conveyed to the British consulate, in conjunction with proper officers deputed by your excellency for the purpose. I shall be prepared to investigate the case myself." Now, Ye Mingchen was not the kind of Qing bureaucrat to whom adhered to, let's say, the finer points of international law. Ye Mingchen had crushed the Taiping rebels within his 2 provinces of control with great brutality. He had executed every captured Taiping rebel along with their wives and children. Sheesh. It is said in Canton alone, the butchery was around 200 Taiping per day. Parkes also sent word to his superior, Sir John Bowring, the governor of Hong Kong. Parkes told him the crewmen were flying the Union Jack, and they deserved the same rights and protections as British subjects. Well, Mr. Bowring was super excited at the opportunity that the Arrow seizure had provided. He sent word back to Parkes, "Cannot we use the opportunity to carry the city question? If so, I will come up with the whole fleet." That fleet would consist of 16 men of war and 3 steamships, all docked at Hong Kong Harbor. Bowring wanted to at least be given permission to move out of the factories and set up shop within Canton proper, as pertaining to the Treaty of Nanjing. However, that part of the treaty was written out properly in English, while the Chinese translation literally stated instead that the foreigners and Chinese should remain segregated. The justification for this, we shall call it a translation error, was the fact that the Qing officials argued there was a ton of xenophobia in Canton. If the British came to live amongst the Cantonese, some might attack or even kill the British. Thus the segregation was, for their protection. Lord Palmerston had given orders not to push the issue of British housing in Canton, because he did not think the risks were even worth the reward. But his representatives, it seems, ignored his orders. After 2 days, Ye Mingchen responded to Park's letter stating he could free 9 out of the 12 crew, but insisted on keeping the remaining 3 because they were all former pirates. As for the Arrow, Ye claimed the captured crew swore an oath that the ship was Chinese-made and Chinese-owned. Ye sent 9 crew with the letter as a show of good faith. Now at this point, it seems obvious Parks was looking to make a diplomatic point more so than getting back the crew, because he refused to accept custody of them. Instead, Park sent another letter to Bowring in Hong Kong suggesting the British should retaliate by seizing a Chinese war junk, particularly the one that was involved in grabbing the Arrow. On October the 14th, the British gunboat Coromandel boarded a Chinese junk without a fight and towed it all the way to Whampoa. Turns out the British did not really think things through though, as the ship ended up being a private craft, not owned by the Qing government. Ye Mingchen simply ignored the matter. Bowring then took the chance to inspect the registration of the Arrow, something Parks had failed to do. Bowring soon discovered Arrow's registry as a British ship had expired on September the 27th. So, by technicality, the Qing had not violated British territoriality by seizing her. Despite Bowring learning the truth of the matter, this did not change his determination to goad Ye Mingchen into action. Bowring told Parks to write a letter to the Viceroy again on October the 21st. But this time, the letter was an ultimatum. Ye Mingchen was given 24 hours to free all 12 crewmen and to provide an official apology and promise to respect all British shipping in China. If Ye did not comply, Her Majesty's naval officers will have recourse to force you to compel complete satisfaction. Ye Mingchen was in a pickle. While he knew full well the British backed up their threats, he also needed to save face. And so Ye Mingchen returned all of the crew, but refused to apologize and offered that in the future he would only consult with foreign interlopers over criminals like the Arrow's pirates. Ye wrote to Parks, "Hereafter, if any lawless characters conceal themselves on board foreign lorchas, you and said consul shall of course be informed the same by declaration in order that you may act with the Chinese authorities in management of such affairs." Ye Mingchen also offered a compromise to avoid similar incidents in the future by adding this. "Hereafter, Chinese officers will on no account without reason seize and take into custody the people belonging to foreign lorchas. But when Chinese subjects build for themselves vessels, foreigners should not sell registers to them. For on occasion it will cause confusion between native and foreign ships, and render it difficult to distinguish between them." Well, Ye Mingchen's response was just what Parks and Bowring needed to commence hostilities, and that is just what they did. On October the 23rd, Parks ordered Rear Admiral Michael Seymour to seize and destroy the 4 barrier forts 5 miles south of Canton on the Pearl River. The Coromandel was the first to open fire on one of the forts, and this was the first shot of the Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War. 2 of the forts fired back on the British fleet before ultimately surrendering. 5 Chinese defenders died, and they would be the first casualties of the war. Rear Admiral Seymour placed blame on the Chinese for the casualties, reporting to Parks, "Loss of 4 or 5 killed on the part of the Chinese was solely arising from their ill-judged resistance to our force." Admiral Seymour's easy victory bolstered Parks' warmongering and drove him to bring the war straight to Ye Mingchen. Parks wrote to Seymour, Should ye still be contumacious, I think that the residents of His Excellency, which is not far from the waterside, should also in that case feel the effects of naval bombardment. Yes, Mr. Harry Parks was pretty much an asshole. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you like visuals? Maybe you like things all Opium War? Over at my channel, I have an episode on the First Opium War, the Second Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion for that matter, and also a historic film review of 1997's The Opium War. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. Well, things got out of hand pretty quickly. The arrow incident, while quite small in scale, was just a match to ignite a growing powder keg. And as Gandalf said in The Lord of the Rings, the board is set, and the pieces are moving. The Second Opium War had just begun.